Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Kelly Salmon Hurley, and I am the co-founder of the Dyslexia Training Institute, and I'm also the co-host of this conference. Today, I'm really excited to introduce to you Dr. Pete Bowers, who is going to be presenting structured word inquiry, what it is, what it isn't, and where it fits in the research. So Dr. Bowers is a teacher, researcher, author, and founder of WordWorks Literacy Center. Peter was an elementary teacher for 10 years before earning his PhD from the Faculty of Education at Queen's University. Dr. Bowers' practical work with schools and educational groups and his published research has been pivotal in transforming how teachers, tutors, and students around the world understand English spelling. Instead of a frustrating system full of exceptions, the structured word inquiry community understands that investigating the spelling, meaning, connections, and words is not only rich literacy instruction, it is rich context for leveraging learning about any subject. His teacher resource book, Teaching How the Written Word Works, expands on the lessons of his vocabulary intervention. That study found generative vocabulary learning for the experimental group and introduced the term structured word inquiry. His workshops have taken him to Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, the Middle East, and North America. So we are really excited to have Dr. Bowers and enjoy your time.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Kelly, for having me. And it's a treat to be invited back. Last year's session was very productive. I mean, the whole thing. And it was interesting when you guys asked me to do this again. I kind of knew what I wanted to do almost right away. I didn't know how to do it, but this idea, why this title, is actually, there's been quite a bit of growth in practice and use and interest in the research as such in structured word inquiry. But that brings with some problems too, because there's a lot of misunderstandings around it are growing as well. So the idea of having this opportunity to clarify what I think it is and what I think it isn't and all that is a great opportunity. So just to give a basic frame, as you mentioned in the intro, that it really came. It's a phrase that came from the grade 4-5 intervention that I did with John Kirby, and it's really about scientific word investigation in educational contexts. So, as you say, it's not just about literacy, all those reading, vocabulary, spelling, but it's also about scientific and critical thinking skills and understanding concepts in any area. And it's also a key thing to understand about it is that it's word level literacy instruction, and that it reflects the interrelation of morphology, etymology, and phonology right from the beginning of instruction. So let's take a look at what that means. To reflect that interrelation, let's look at what the model of orthography that I learned about from working with real spelling. And as you see in this model, these three aspects of orthography of language and are represented by the orthography, and they're interconnected is what this is signaling. And that the morphology is the constraining structure in which the phonological, etymological aspects fall. And of course, the primary purpose of orthography is to represent the sense and meaning of the language to those who already know and speak the language. Now, you may have heard of, if you've encountered structured word inquiry as a teacher or something, you may have heard people talk about the 4 questions of structured word inquiry. This is a little model of those questions. A larger one is over here that has a little bit more detail. Now, these are just my most recent wording of how I like to think about those questions. I've changed that wording a number of times. It's not like I own the wording. Anybody else can revise it. But we're going to find how, when you work through these questions, these questions are appropriate for trying to make sense of and understand the spelling of any word. Not to memorize the spelling, but to understand the spelling. Of course, if you understand the spelling, you're more likely, you don't feel the need to memorize it. So one quick intro of understanding something by understanding what it's not. I just want to highlight at this top 2 common misunderstandings of structured word inquiry. One is it is not morphological instruction. Morphological instruction is crucial to it, But there's lots of things out there that are called morphological instruction that is not structured word inquiry, because structured word inquiry is teaching the orthography system, which necessitates teaching how all of those parts work. The other piece that is crucial to understand, it does not minimize the role of phonology. In fact, it demands explicit instruction about how grapheme-phoneme correspondences work right from the start. So, as I mentioned, there's a growing community. Really, there's people working on this around the world. There's certain areas you see here where there's particular hubs of people working with this because of people repeat visits to these areas, and then people on site getting experience and becoming their own leaders in this work, which is great. There's also a whole international school community where this stuff is growing. So the rate of growth is great, but as I say, pros and cons. One pro is that there's just a really growing number of resources. I just got excited about getting new resources at the etymology conference that Gina Cook and Doug Harper did in Portland, with resources from people who haven't previously published stuff on this. And it's just having more and more access to linguistically reliable tools for teachers is brilliant. There's also a lot more online courses people are taking and giving. Again, more leaders and studiers of this stuff. The other thing that's a pro is that it's actually so much easier to learn now because you're entering a community that has lots of expertise. Whereas when I first encountered it, there was just a few people that you could really learn with. So as it grows, it kind of feeds itself. But as I say, the cons that as the people running into it expands, it can kind of get diluted sometimes. And so it's easy for misunderstandings to spread. And that happens both in practical context with teachers and tutors, but also in the research context. So let's think about this in terms of the research. While it is certainly fair to say it's growing in interest in the research, it is just beginning. It is not like structured word inquiry is a big deal in the research or anything, but there's just been a couple of intervention studies. There's a bunch going on at the moment, actually. But it is starting to be discussed more. I've been involved in publishing some more things on it. But the way that it's the most of the backing behind it is actually indirect. So although structured word inquiry isn't morphological instruction, the research on morphological instruction is something that informs understanding about what structured word inquiry is and what it might be able to do. And there's also lots of theory that we're going to look at. But again, just to caution, I'm not claiming that structured word inquiry is a big deal. It's something that is still a very small part, but I think an exciting part that's getting more and more interest. So why this label? Well, I mean, first of all, it's just a descriptive phrase. Structured word inquiry is instruction about the structure of words. And it's also about inquiry. It's really about scientific inquiry. So that was the impetus for it. I like the idea of not just inquiry instruction, but structured inquiry, and that it's about word structure. It functions when you have a label like this, it functions to kind of bring a community around that. This novel set of ideas. Otherwise, how do you find it? So you can Google it, you can find videos on YouTube, look it up and research and such. But crucially, I think it kind of highlights a very specific hypothesis and question that I want to look at. And that is the central hypothesis or question of a structured word inquiry that is putting forward is, what if English spelling makes sense? Well, it's actually kind of that seems so crazy, but it actually turns out to be the case. And that's how I got interested in the first place. Now, the idea that proposing that English spelling makes sense and showing some evidence for it, but it's kind of a challenging hypothesis because it really directly counters every message we ourselves encountered since we were in kindergarten. When I do workshops and people are new to it, you ask them to talk about spelling, nobody thinks it makes sense. Everybody thinks it's full of exceptions. So it's hard it can be a bit difficult, but it's also a very joyful hypothesis to interrogate, it turns out. And the evidence is surprisingly straightforward. Really, within 5 minutes, I can make sense of tons of spellings that people have thought were irregular for ages. So spellings that best practice has had children memorize because they didn't make sense, all of a sudden you can understand them. So the initial introduction is, wow, it isn't difficult to show people that there is understandings to have that they did not previously have. And we should be thinking like, well, hey, how is that possible? And we should also be thinking, what are the implications for how I've been thinking about spelling if somebody can come out and explain a whole bunch of spellings that for years I thought were crazy? Well, the thing is, excuse me, we have scientific inquiry of orthography, but you need to have reliable tools and concepts with which to do that. And once you have that, you can start to make sense of it. So they include the word sum and the matrix, which are linguistic tools. Not invented recently. The word sum is just the linguistic tool for analyzing word structure. The matrix was, as far as I understand, brought to English by Real Spelling, but has existed for ages. And so all of a sudden, a word like because that is typically treated as irregular, and kids struggle with the spelling of it and all that. Well, if you investigate its base, C-A-U-S-E, you can see how that base is a word cause. And you can say, well, this is because of that. This is the cause of that. And then you can look at other words like causation and causal and because. And now you have to look at suffixing changes that occur and stuff. But the key is, if you understand that cause and because are connected in meaning, it can help you understand that the spelling makes more sense. If you can spell cause, you can spell because. And now issues like why not a U or why not a Z and such like that, you can have a meaningful connection between related words. Again, as another example that is a common one that surprises people is that does is always thought of as irregular, but when you look at its structure, you find that it's got a base do, which also builds doing, done, and the word do. And we could look at goes, going, gone. And as typical instruction would have us put does as an irregular word to memorize, but treat goes like it's regular. Well, what's happening is by looking at morphological families at one time, understanding the structures, we start to learn that a foundational feature of English as a morphophonemic language is the pronunciations of these morphemes can shift, but the spelling stays the same for the purpose of meaning representation. So we can all of a sudden make sense of words that previously we'd have to tell a kid to memorize. Now we can say, let's investigate it, we can understand. Another key aspect in structured word inquiry is making sure we understand how the grapheme-phoneme correspondences work. So you'll see angle brackets to mark orthographic information like a T, and we can see that the T grapheme can write T, but it turns out it can also write sh and ch. And then we can see words in which that happens. Let me get this out of the way. And if we now take a word family, we can see this base ACT, we can look at words that it builds, and now we can have a better way to understand how come the spelling action of the word action needs to have the T grapheme, because you needed the grapheme that can write the T of act, but the sh of action. So it can't be spelled with an SH because that SH couldn't write the T of act. So this is this interrelation piece that is so crucial to structured word inquiry and is not at all even, I would say, a common feature when I look at other stuff called morphological instruction. And as a really early example, something like the ED suffix being pronounced in 3 ways, but when the ED isn't actually a suffix, it can be pronounced a different way. So you can't actually know, if you say jumped, if you go for the sound letter correspondences, absent morphology, why wouldn't you put a T? Well, because jumped, you mean the past tense, so you need the suffix that is spelled ED, whether it's pronounced or id. But if you have a word bed, the ED can do that job because that ED is not a suffix. So looking at this interrelation, a couple of etymological examples. Again, the word to is usually thought of as irregular, but once you get used to these concepts, we can have letters that don't actually have a phonological role at all in a word. The W in to serves at least 2 functions. One is to distinguish it from its other potential homophones and to link it to words like twice, 20, between, that have this idea of two things. Similarly, the O in people is not a grapheme. It's not an EO digraph. It has the function of linking us to popular population. So if you can't understand the spelling of people or the number 2 absent showing information about etymology. And then that was synchronic etymology. Diachronic etymology is when you're looking back through time, diachronic, and we get back to roots, and we can actually look at what a Latin root was. And actually, the A in the Latin root is actually part of the reason we use the EA digraph in please, because it is a reflection of where it came from. And of course, the EA in please also serves phonologically, because the EA can represent the of pleasure and the E of please. But we'll find more about the etymology that we'll be looking at. So once you have some tools that helps you make sense of things. But this idea that English spelling makes much more sense than we ever thought provokes another issue. It's actually quite challenging to accept evidence that falsifies long-held assumptions. So you can get a little bit of evidence, but people are not always open to changing long-held beliefs. And it turns out, that's my experience, is that children have less difficulty with this because they have less unlearning to do. And that means that we actually, oftentimes, teachers and researchers have a bigger challenge to accept the evidence, the orthographic evidence that I present, because it counters the way they've looked at the world for a long time. So let's take an introduction to the research. As I said, it's the term that grew out of a grade 4 or 5 intervention I did with John Kirby. What I wanted to do is just show you a section of, how can I do this? A section, try to get me, and I guess I'll do that, from the article. And I just want you can freeze, there'll be a few times where I ask you just to freeze the page so you can read it. And then I'm going to point to a couple things. So go ahead and freeze. And as you read through this, you will see that it's this idea about scientific inquiry is all the way through: testing hypotheses, developing hypotheses, identifying a problem, getting to a core orthographic principle, practice, identifying new questions at the end of investigation. And again, this idea of we had exploratory problem solving, hypotheses development, hypothesis testing, and then practice. So that's how we were describing the intervention in this grade 4 or 5 intervention that we described as structured word inquiry. And from the beginning, it's always been about using scientific inquiry. And we mentioned about this. Now I want to highlight, not only is it literacy, it's also about deepening understanding and articulation of ideas. So when I give you some handouts, I'll point to some videos. Here's a video a grade 5 student did where she talked about, did this investigation because she was studying the French Resistance, and she found all sorts of cool things about that. Here's a video from a school in Kuala Lumpur where a kid in a humanities class has a really powerful talk about what a dissident is in their humanities class, but drawing on their linguistic stuff. This is just an image of working at a grade 1 class where I was asked to help kids who were just starting to write their very first journals. And I hadn't looked at the word journal before, but in that class, I was, hey, wait a second, I bet you that the Journ is the same Journ in journal as in journey. And we looked it up and we found it out. So this is just a little example of not just talking about orthography, but understanding ideas. And so the idea of that being for Journ, for day, the journal is about the experience of your day, your journey through the day. And then we talked about soup du jour, which has got to be related and stuff like that. I'll give you one more example of using it to expand on ideas. This just happened to be something where I had a class that was looking at, one class was looking at what's a mediator in a debate. And so I looked at this matrix with the MEDI base, and we could see that it went back to this idea of middle between from this Latin root. And so if you're a mediator, well, if you have a mediator, it's because you have a problem between two people. Someone gets in the middle, it doesn't take sides and tries to understand. And then we also could talk about In math, another class asked about mean, median, mode, and we could see that actually the median is the middle number. So the median is that middle number when put in order from lowest to highest. Mean turns out to go back to the same root, although it doesn't have that base, and it means middle between. It's the line through the middle, but mode isn't related. Mode is what happens most. So you could actually understand that math concept better by investigating this. And the craziest one was a kindergarten class was talking about medieval times. And I ended up going through some of these words with them, and we got MEDI. And when I pointed the mediocre, you're not the best, you're not the worst. If you're intermediate, you're kind of in the middle. And they knew that. That's part of their language. And when I pointed to this EVE and I said, well, that EVE is a base for age, a kid instantly said, Middle Ages. There it is. So you can inspect that a bit more on your own if you like, but just to signal how this stuff can inform all over the place. Then this idea of bringing critical thinking through scientific inquiry, but the critical thinking of the scientific inquiry is of the orthography system. And again, it's not a program. There's not a scope and sequence. There's core concepts that you need to understand. It's not morphological instruction. It's not a version of whole language. And the other key thing that always comes up, it does not ignore or underrepresent phonological factors. I'll try to make that clear today. And in terms of its place in the research, very early. It's something that's just being tested for the first time. I'm pleased to know there's a number of projects going on right now, but my main work is trying to make the case that there's enough evidence that we should be testing this more. So it's relevant to morphological instruction, but it's not the same thing. I can say that if we find out that morphological instruction is very helpful, that is supportive of structured word inquiry, because structured word inquiry requires morphological instruction. But structured word inquiry is suggesting a particular way in which morphology should be taught, which is in conjunction with phonology and etymology. And we don't have research about what's the best way to teach morphology yet, but this is trying to point a way for testing. And as I say, it's crucial for anything to be called structured word inquiry. It would have to be looking at the interrelation of these features. And if you just think about what it is, it's a response to the straightforward hypothesis that literacy instruction should reflect how our writing system works. It seems like a pretty straightforward idea, but even before we get to that, I want to highlight, if we're saying it's scientific inquiry, I want to highlight guiding scientific principles that I draw on all the time when I'm trying to understand a spelling myself. And there's lots of spellings I don't yet understand, and I encounter them. And we're teaching kids how to be, and teachers, how to be scientists. We think, hey, is this word related to that word? And in that process, we get a lot of learning, but we have to have a way of falsifying ideas and all that. So scientific inquiry seeks the deepest structures that account for the greatest number of cases, a very key point that we'll draw on. Another way of talking about it is the most elegant solution is preferred. This is the description of data that invokes the fewest entities. So sometimes people will try to say there's like 5 suffixes, when in fact you could explain all of those with 2. So that's a better description. And we'll talk about examples of that. We also have to be very careful about scientific conclusions versus hypotheses, both when we're talking about understanding orthography and when we're talking about understanding the research. So I can propose a hypothesis and it might be right, but I have to test it before I come to a conclusion. That will come up. And we shouldn't draw conclusions beyond the evidence. So that comes up a lot, both in the orthography and in research. Another thing to highlight is this concept of falsification. That without falsification, we just aren't in science. And we'll talk about that. Let's take a look at that first. Here's a way of illustrating using falsification in the structured word inquiry investigation. So if we take the word question, you can often ask, well, does it have a TION or an ION suffix? Well, how are we going to find out that answer? Well, a common way that it's done is to go to some other source and let people tell you. So this is a popular morphological resource, and it gives me TION as a suffix, and it gives me these words as examples that have TIONs, but it doesn't give me the word question, so I can't use it for my question. And if I go to the Oxford, it also tells me there's a TION suffix, and it gives me completion and relation, but that doesn't help me with the actual question I have, because I don't know if it is in this word. But what we are, the mistake we're doing is we're not doing science. We should realize this is an empirical question which warrants scientific inquiry. And so we can walk through this process of doing the investigation. So we go back to those 4 questions. What does the word question mean? Well, I don't mean that you come up with a dictionary definition, but have the kids discuss, well, use the word question. And if a kid says, well, I have a question, well, okay, they mean, and I have to clarify, you mean, oh, you want to ask a question. So I want to ask something. Okay, I don't understand something I want to ask about it. Okay, well, that doesn't answer my question yet, but at least I make sure we know what we're talking about. And then we can look at these, how is it built and what are some relatives? And when we do that, we're trying to find out what is the structure. And so now the thing is, when you're testing the question, when you're doing a hypothesis, you have to deal with the consequences of your hypothesis. So we would make 2 word sums, one with the TION and one with the ION. And once you look at those 2 possibilities, most people see pretty quickly, it can't be the first one because QUES doesn't mean anything. Whereas QUEST, well, that's interesting because if quest is the word is the base for question, then asking a question is going on a quest. That would be very cool. So we've passed what I would call the structure test. But what we haven't done is, do we have a real knowledge, there's a real meaning connection, or is it just happenstance that it's be a cool idea? Well, that's when you have to go to the historical meaning connection. Is there an etymological connection between quest and question? And that we can be reminded by with these 4 questions. When we're looking for related words, not only are we reminded to look for morphological relatives, we need to look for etymological relatives, ones that share history. And only if we do that can we come to a safe conclusion, as opposed to just have a hypothesis. And so my Oxford tells me that they are related, so does etym-online, and we see in all cases they're going back to the same root. Etym-online gives us a little wider frame of understanding, seek, gain, ask. So when you investigate this, you can say, when you're going on a conquest, which is related, there's not much asking, but there's gaining going on. But if you have an inquest, it is asking a question. So the other piece now, we haven't forgotten about the pronunciation, because now that we know these are related, we notice that with quest, that T, sorry, I can't put the picture in the right place ever. The T is writing T in quest, but it's writing ch in question. And again, the same point, we can understand why we wouldn't write question with a CH or something. But let's look back at the words that were given to us as words using a TION suffix. I don't know, I'm gonna have to hide this for a second. So all of these are the words that were given to us. And if we tested that hypothesis, not one of them works. There's no case in which any of these words is understandable with a TION suffix. So we go down and we see, well, as soon as you falsify something, it gives you a reason to try something else. And it turns out the ION suffix works with all of them. We learn that vowel suffixes replace final non-syllabic e's. So this idea of falsification, the words that were given to us as examples of words with TION by a teacher resource and by the Oxford English Dictionary simply don't work. We don't go to references to be given answers. We start to be a scientist and we question things. And we have evidence that we know how to find it. So word sums allow us to falsify things that we've been told for years. And that's a good thing. The problem is, instruction which presents TION as a suffix, it misrepresents the writing system. Well, why? How big a deal is it? Well, I would say it hinders access to the meaning connection. If you think action has a TION, you might not notice the act. I didn't notice that to ask a question is to go on a quest until my 9th year as a teacher, when I thought of a word sum for it. So that is a key point. And it also allows us to teach grapheme-phoneme correspondences, because now we can understand better what are the possible phonemes that a grapheme can represent and the circumstances under which it can do it. If I don't have the morphological connection here, it's like, for my brain, it's like 50-50, would I use a CH or use a T? Those who have a good orthographic memory, they don't wonder about it. But if a kid is struggling and writing action with a CH, why not give them the help of seeing how it's related to act? And so this idea that falsifying a TION brings clarity to spelling and meaning connections that we otherwise just cannot have. So when I do this kind of workshop with teachers, I often start with this. So just to give you some background on the orthography, and then we can dive more into the research. And this is what people suggest, that it's crazy, irregular, all that. And so we take that as a hypothesis, and I ask them to give me evidence. And here's some slides from previous workshops of a kind of words teachers give me, well-trained teachers, of words that are irregular. And I think you'll recognize why. Here's another group, and here's another group. And there's all sorts of things here. Now one of these we have because that we already took care of. There's because, and there's the 2, 2, and 2. We've already started to take on, but in all of them, you will notice that homophones keep coming up. Night and night, there, 2, 2, 2, here. Well, that homophone thing is a very helpful thing. And from what is a homophone? Well, when you look at the structure, homo, same, phone, sound. So two words that can have the same pronunciation versus a homograph, two words with the same spelling. Now, the thing that's interesting is if you, let's take a look at an example of some homophones. If I take the word here and here, how do I know which is which? And I'm going to have to move out of this mode and do this mode now. How do I know which is which? Well, if I talk about come over here, I can't hear you, and I have that conversation, I could ask, well, are there any related words that might help me with that spelling? And people always notice that the one for I hear you shares a spelling sequence with the thing that you hear. Well, that's kind of neat. Maybe it's just happenstance, but I could also say, what about come over here, go over there, where are my keys? And now these are all words about place, and then we can notice that all of these words also have a similar spelling. Now, if you're looking at it, some of you are thinking you've noticed the combination ERE, and some have noticed HERE. The interesting thing is, why would anybody not notice the H? Well, because this is a THERE, and that's a WHERE, and the H, the fact that that's a digraph makes people not be able to treat those as the same, and I think that's quite fascinating. But the bigger point is we can now see what we know they should be spelled differently because they're homophones, and we can also instead of memorizing, we have something to hold it on to, a meaning to hold the spelling onto. This there, of course, has its homophone, THEIR. So their house is beautiful. They have a beautiful house. I wish I had a house like them. Well, again, we're seeing that these spellings are connected in meaning and spelling. Now, this one is often derided as irregular. Well, this one is derided as irregular because it's E before I, but there's thousands of exceptions to the I before E rule. So why are we calling it a rule? It's not breaking a rule because the rule didn't exist. This word they, people would say, well, it should be spelled with an AY, that would make more sense. Well, the reason it's not spelled that way is that if it was, it would hide the connection to meaning to its neighbors. So the other question, if you're a scientist, instead of saying it should be AY, but it's weird, so I use an EY, the discovery that all of a sudden there's an EY, if you didn't know that there's an EY digraph that can write the phoneme A we have in they, it's cool. It's like, excellent. Well, can you think of other words? Well, I can think, as soon enough in a class, we come up with words like pray versus pray. Well, good thing they're not spelled the same, which mean, and then we can also say, well, how do we remember which is which? Well, this prey is related to predator. So you see how, you get these connections. And if I take the word, another word that has an EY for the phoneme A is obey. And I bet you can think of a related word before I even type it. If you obey somebody, you are obedient. So all of a sudden, we're not just trying to memorize sound letter correspondences. We're not trying to memorize the spelling of words. We're investigating words, and we're along the way, we're learning new digraphs. There's nothing wrong with having more than one way to write the phoneme A. AY isn't a better way to write that. It might be more common. That doesn't make it better. In fact, this is one of the key messages that homophones give us. That we need multiple ways to write the same phonemes, otherwise we couldn't separate homophones. And so and not only is it doing that, it's also allowing us to make links between related words. So that's like a little pass through ways that you can bring, this is etymology, by the way, we're talking about these kind of connections as etymological choices for graphemes. And the thing that I want to highlight is this idea that homophones are always presented to me as examples of spelling being crazy. Well, that is growing from a long-built assumption that the primary job of spelling is to represent sound. But that just isn't the case, and homophones are a very good test for it, because if that hypothesis were true, homophones would be spelled the same. And yet when I present these kinds of pairs to kids and I ask them, why do you think here and here aren't spelled the same? They say without hesitation, well, because they're different words, because it'd be confusing if they were spelled the same. So the fact that we have many ways to write the sounds in English, it's not a bug, it's a feature. We couldn't do this if we didn't have many ways to write the sounds. The problem is that hypothesis is often treated as though we say the primary job of spelling is to represent sound, and it's a system full of exceptions. But we shouldn't be talking about exceptions as scientists. We should be saying, wait a second, if my description can't explain the data, I need to look at my description. Somehow I pick on frogs. If I was a scientist and I had a hypothesis that describes frogs, and I'm all excited, I have my life's work, and I write my paper and I say, look, I can explain 80% of frogs. This is great. Of course, 20% of frogs are exceptions. It's an absurd statement. Of course, I would never say that. But we do hear lots of time people say, well, English spelling is like 80% regular. Well, wait a second. Maybe what we should be doing is taking the fact that we're failing to explain a bunch of words as evidence that our description isn't doing right. And then we can look for, and that's falsification. That's what science is about. It means I have a reason to look for another answer. Otherwise, if I don't have falsification, I have license to say anything I want. And the answer, when my hypothesis doesn't work, I just say, oh, I guess spelling's crazy. And that is when you've exited science, if you can't falsify things. So it turns out the homophones help us see that the primary job of spelling is the representing of the sense and meaning of words to those who already speak the language. Now, and that description fits what we see with homophones. It also fits what we saw with morphemes, that the base of the word does is spelled D-O because it can represent the pronunciation of do and does. Again, meaning is the primary thing, but you have to understand the grapheme-phoneme correspondences as well. This homophone thing I'm saying isn't a new idea. Linguists have named it the homophone principle, and that is, Vinetsky talks about this, wherever two words can have the same pronunciation, wherever possible, the spelling has evolved to be different to signal that difference. And it turns out this really isn't a hypothesis, it's well-established theory. So this idea. Our instruction should reflect the idea how central meaning is to the spellings of words and to which graphemes to choose and what etymological information helps. So if we go back to this idea, I think we can agree that with this statement here, a basic assumption, learners deserve instruction that represent how the writing system works. I'll let you just read that from major work, and notice this conventional forms, that's just another way of saying orthographic conventions. And so this is where I get this statement. So let's take a look at that. The thing is, it's a non-controversial statement to say that English is a morphophonemic language. And just looking at the word morphophonemic, I think you're getting the sense of what I'm talking about, this interrelationship. Have a read of this quote. And you might have noticed that the statement is that phoneme and morpheme share leading roles, and notice the date. This is not new information. The question is, how can instruction represent how the writing system works if it's not addressing these leading roles? And what does the research say about morphological instruction? Well, I think it helps to get a little bit of background. We've heard of these reading wars, phonics and whole language. Well, there's a great amount of research concluding phonics instruction has been more effective than whole language instruction. All right. What does that evidence tell us about the effect of morphological instruction? And my argument is it doesn't, because it hasn't tested the morphological instruction. So let's take a look at, let's read this statement. Now, this is from a seminal book by Mary Lambs. It's not the main point of what she was doing. She was talking about the evidence that phonics-based instruction, phonemic awareness, more effective than whole language. And she showed lots of evidence for that statement. Here she's not making a claim that she has evidence. She's presenting a hypothesis. She's not claiming it to be a research-based conclusion. The problem is, a decade later, National Reading Panel didn't say, hey, maybe we should test this hypothesis. Nor did the article I pointed to earlier, that major review. But what we're behaving as though this statement, it's not just from here, but she's reflecting the way the world kind of thinks about things. And since it fits the way we think about things, we don't think to check it. And so we kind of behave as though this assertion is a research-based conclusion when it was just a hypothesis. Now, 2 decades later, we do have some evidence. I'm going to let you freeze that so you can look at it a little bit more closely. This thing. But I will point out, so hopefully you've frozen it and taken a little look, but I can highlight some things. Notice every review or meta-analysis that looked at overall groups, Goodwin and Ann's, this study was only for less able, so it had no overall group, but it seems to help everybody. When we look at age, the effects of the preschool to grade 2 in our study was always equal to and usually greater than the effects of the older grades. And everybody who looked at younger grades found an advantage for younger kids. And the effects were even more clearly better for the less able. That means this evidence is in direct contrast to what was hypothesized. It's not that what was hypothesized wasn't supported very clearly. It's that the opposite of the hypothesis is what we find in the most recent research of meta-analysis. Now, there's a study that, as I say, there's been very few studies looking at structured word inquiry. Really, Devonshire has a couple, and I have one, and that's it, as far as I know. As I say, there's more on the way, but this is one study that's particularly useful because she was looking at explicit instruction in morphology, etymology, phonology compared to phonics with young children, and in a public school. And you can let you read the finding. So they got effects in standardized measures of reading and spelling. Now there's actually a little debate going on right now that I want to let you guys see about Devonshire's article. This is a time where you really need to freeze it to read. So I'm going to assume that you'll hit pause and read this page, which is the description of the phonics condition. So assuming that you've done that, I want to highlight, this is a recent paper that's just out, and here's the reference. It's actually in the press, a corrected proof version, but have a read of how Devonshire's study is described. Particularly here, the idea that it's being described not as a phonics reading scheme, it takes a more whole word approach. So the argument is that actually the reading I get from this is that the control condition, the phonics, the alternative treatment, wasn't really phonics. So she's saying it's not really a test for structured word inquiry compared to phonics. But if you've read, this is the study, all of the white there is all about all the detailed phonics kind of instruction. And then there's this section here. Notice that the standard, this is, does the fact that the phonics condition also included some time with kids taking a new book home to read each week to learn sentences by rote disqualify this as a phonics intervention? In my view, it doesn't. And you can draw your own conclusions. That's why I wanted to show you the whole page. But I also like to highlight something else. Every phonics program I've ever seen has phrases like this: non-decodable words, irregular, audible words, the words that it can't explain, which demands that they have whole word instruction. So whole word instruction is part of every phonics program I've ever seen. So in my view, Devonshire's paper is a good test of structured word inquiry compared to phonics. And now you have some place to go check in on that debate. So a common misunderstanding in the research, as I've said, is this confounding of morphological instruction and structured word inquiry. And a reason that's a problem, well, one reason it's a problem, is that it feeds this misunderstanding that structured word inquiry avoids, reduces explicit grapheme-phoneme correspondence instruction. And that's simply not the case. And I need to help people understand why that's the case. Another one is that it's often argued that I and others are making a strong suggestion that about the research evidence for structured word inquiry. And the concern is often, especially from the beginning. So here's an example from that same article I just mentioned. So this argument that Bowers and Bowers put forward a strong case that the relationships between phonology, orthography, morphology, and etymology should be the basis of reading instruction from its earliest stages. Well, here's actually the section from our summary. I'll let you freeze and read that. Assuming that you've done that, I want to highlight, we're saying that actually the research on SWI is only beginning. I would argue that there's strong theoretical motivation. That I think there is a strong case for the hypothesis. And then here's two other sections from that same summary in our paper that I'll let you freeze and read. And then highlight, we are saying little evidence is available concerning how best to teach this stuff. We don't have research evidence that the best way to teach morphology is in this interrelationship. We don't have research evidence of there's Devonshire at the young grades, but that's not a lot of evidence by any means. We're saying clearly we need more research. And this is the main thing. Our main goal is to help inspire more research into teaching children the logic of the spelling system. That's the last line of our paper. We are not claiming that there's lots of evidence for structured word inquiry, research evidence. If the statement was stated instead this way, if it was stated that Bowers and Bowers have put forward a strong case that we need to test the hypothesis that the relationship between morphology, phonology, and etymology, that I'm totally down with. But I think it's a misrepresentation if you aren't receiving that message from that paper. So I want to be as clear as I can. I am not claiming that there's a lot of evidence for structured word inquiry from intervention research, and I've never made that claim. So let's take a look at this. Some common criticisms about structured word inquiry and morphological instruction. That introducing morphology may be useful as long as it doesn't reduce time. Now, I've heard that argument many times. Morphology and etymology are too complicated. Children need to start the letter sound correspondence first. There's so much evidence that we need to teach phonology first. Struggling kids in particular need to learn phonology before instruction. The thing is, these are all totally good hypotheses. They're empirical claims, though, which means they need evidence. And here's the quote I said before, which is, these are basically saying very much what was said back in 1990. It might be a problem for the less skilled to teach about morphology. Now, this isn't about structured word inquiry, but if you taught structured word inquiry, you'd be doing morphology from the start. So this is a common argument. So let's take this statement. A common assertion in the research, and I think this is a fair representation of what I was just saying, literacy instruction should begin with phonics. Therefore, instruction about morphology and etymology should be introduced later. I think that is a common view in the research. Well, there's two scientific ways to present that assertion. It could be presented as a hypothesis that we need to test, totally legitimate. It can be presented as a research-based conclusion with evidence to support it, but then we would need the evidence to support it. And I want to take a look at what would that look like. What is the context of research that has given rise to this assertion? Well, it's been a comparison, I would argue, of comparing A, phonics instruction, to B, whole language with little or no phonics. So if you compare A to B, it doesn't give you evidence about C. So this is a claim that would need studies that have looked at C. And I haven't seen evidence that supports that. Now, nor, to be emphasized instantly, nor is there evidence that C is better than A or B. So I'm not saying because we don't have this evidence that therefore structured word inquiry is better. I'm saying we don't have evidence. What I am saying is we have evidence for the need of research, and that's exactly what we said in our last sentence in that paper that was cited earlier. Our goal, and my goal right now, and in general, is to get more people to understand the orthography system so that they can start to look at how it might be able to be tested and instructed in school so that we can test this. And whether we test it or not, I'm finding lots of anecdotal results. It's going great. But if people are worried about the research side, they need to test the hypothesis. And so, yes, there's little direct research comparing structured word inquiry and phonics. So we can look at the research evidence regarding morphological instruction, the idea that it should be avoided until after phonological instruction, and that we already looked at it. The evidence actually doesn't support that. It supports the opposite. If this hypothesis were supported, we wouldn't have found these results for the less able and the younger. So we don't actually have, the evidence does not support that assertion. Now, doesn't mean we're done studying it, but so far the evidence points to, hey, it seems to help the youngest and the less able if we include morphological instruction from the start. Never am I saying teach morphology first and phonology second. I'm saying we have to teach the interrelationship from the start. So the empirical evidence is in direct contrast to long-held assumptions. And I would argue that the research community has a duty to reflect on the implications of that evidence. What does it mean if all of a sudden these results didn't happen what we thought? Maybe we have some assumptions that are false that we have to interrogate. So here's some related hypotheses that kind of are logically provoked out of what we've found so far. I wonder, could grapheme-phoneme correspondence learning be improved by the linguistic context of structural inquiry? Maybe one of the reasons that in those morphological interventions kids did better is in part because it taught the grapheme-phoneme correspondences better. It's a possibility. And if so, might the benefits be better with the less able and the youngest? These are hypotheses, not claims. But they're hypotheses that logically grow from the evidence that we have. So let's think about that for a second. If we teach phonics, we're teaching grapheme-phoneme correspondences. Let's think about with or without morphological and etymological cues. So let's just take the EA digraph. There is an EA digraph, and it can do a couple of jobs at least. If we teach this in an isolated phonics way, we could teach one of its pronunciations first, so we could write the EA for E phoneme, and then teach a bunch of words that do that, and then we could then teach the EA for the in other places, or we could do that at the same time. But regardless, the grapheme choice ends up being treated as a random thing. Like you don't know why you use the EA here and the double E here or something like that. Whereas if we were coming at this from a structured word inquiry frame, you would encounter the EA digraph in a meaningful morphological family where both pronunciations are used. It would become a point of interest because the EA changes pronunciation and links meaningful things. Adding meaning to instruction is a good thing. And it builds understanding of why this dual job of the EA can be useful. So I'll in the handouts and such, I'll make sure you have links to this. I recently took a little video walking around friend Carolee's class in a preschool class, and they're doing quite astonishing things there. And she's been working at this for a long time. And in that film, one of the things that came up was this web on the word heel. And the reason they were studying they picked this word is because a kid in the class had had their tonsils taken out, and so the word families they chose weren't random either. They were in a meaningful context. They were hoping that their classmate would heal and get healthy. And as Carolee describes, this was the big reveal, the cool thing, that heal and health were related. And all of a sudden, the EA became an interesting point because it was linking the meaningful things, and they had this different pronunciation. So you can use these symbols. She also points out that the homophone thing came up right with them, and they noticed that there's this word, HEEL, there's a homophone for this one. And so now they know the double E digraph because they were looking at the EA in health. So I encourage you to watch how we can introduce the grapheme-phoneme correspondences and the morphology from the start, and that they actually help each other. It's not a hindrance. And again, this is going back to the fact that the phonology is crucial to structural word inquiry from the beginning. It's just that it's taught within where it operates within the morphological and etymological families. And I'll point to other things, examples of teaching. I was teaching a lesson with the S grapheme, and we discovered that it could be pronounced S or Z. And there's more with this preschool class. Another video you'll be able to see where they take the word rain, and the kids are brainstorming words that they could build on the base rain, raining, rains. And actually she just very briefly, but she comments on, rains, isn't that interesting that the Z is being written with an S? But I encourage you to see those examples. A whole pile of examples of here's a grade 1 class introducing this stuff. One of the things that makes it hard for people to understand when they read a research article about what structured word inquiry is because they haven't had the experience of seeing it. You need to see the matrices and the word sums and how people are using them to be able to even consider the possibility. So I want to highlight that I'm not presenting these videos as evidence for structured word inquiry, research evidence. It's illustrations of possible instruction that warrants research. And when you walk into these classes, when you see these classes, you'll see this is a grapheme-phoneme chart identifying initial, medium, and final positions of graphemes. It's absolutely central to structured word inquiry, but in context. And one of the most basic practices in structured word inquiry that I always talk about, and I talked about in the first paper, is this writing out loud of word sums. And the very explicit instruction is in the base to be able to announce any graphemes or markers. So if I was going to write out this word sum, it would PLEASE, and that EA is announced together to fix that EA digraph in your mind. And the URE we announce quickly to treat as a unit, and then we go through it. But the people look at word sums and they think morphology. I'm trying to highlight that I have emphasized forever that if you're going to work with these, we get to look at the grapheme-phoneme correspondences in there as well. Now, there's an example from a grade 1 class that there's a text about that, and I'll show you an example again of the grapheme-phoneme morpheme instruction. And what happened was the teacher I forget when it was in the year, but they were working on their transitions between classes. So they wanted, between activities in the class. And so they wanted me to work on the word transition. Notice I didn't come up with a transition. It was in the culture of the classroom. And I know something about the word transition, so I've planted some things in here. And they also, at that school, they always talk about, they have these things they call appreciations. So appreciations are part of the language of the class. They have a period where they give appreciations of everybody. Very lovely. And reflected was another word that they encountered earlier. So I've planted a bunch of things in here. But the one I planted that I dealt with first was this word acted. Because I knew if we looked at acted, they could find the ed suffix and they can find the base ACT, and we could go on and they can come up with other words based on that base, and then we can look at the phonology. So again, we see the T writing T in act and actress, but once we did action, all of a sudden we get to encounter this different pronunciation of the T, but we also have to learn the conventions for it. And so we get this little matrix that we make, and we learn that actually it turns out if an I follows the T, it can write sh or t. And we see that with acting, where the T is writing t, but action, where I can't see that under that. I'm going to hide that, sorry. So we see that the T is running t in actor and acting, but in action, it's writing sh. And again, we see why you couldn't write with an SH. So what do we do then? Well, then we went into the word that the teacher had asked for. And they lived in San Francisco. They knew about BART Transit, the city transit. We know what transit is, and they're talking about transitions. So we could get transit and do the same thing we do with act and action. And then I gave them a pile of these things, and they ran around the school, around the classroom, looking for words that use the T grapheme for t and for sh, and they're having a blast. But that grapheme phoneme correspondence is being taught in the context of meaning. It's not random whether it's t or sh. They have to know the oral word, and they look at the structure, and they're focusing tightly on the grapheme phoneme correspondences in a meaningful context. So where does this structural word inquiry fit in the research? Well, in terms of direct evidence, there is very little. There's Devonshire's paper, a couple papers, and I have one in the grade 4-5 level, but all of those studies were positive. But the indirect evidence is important. So we have evidence that morphological instruction helps in general, but in particular, the less able and the youngest, in direct contrast to what was previously assumed. So far, I know of zero evidence showing we should avoid morphological or etymological instruction. And I've asked many people to show me this, but I've never found anybody who could find evidence that there's a problem with doing it. There's hypotheses that it might be a problem, and it may be, but you'd have to find the evidence. So far, the meta-analyses pointing the opposite direction. So what do we do in the absence of further evidence? Well, let's draw on theory. That's not a bad idea. I would argue that and this is all of this is out of the 2017 paper with my brother Jeff Bowers. The default assumption, I would argue, is that instruction should accurately represent the content being taught. It seems like a straightforward idea. Now, it's possible that it's too complex. It's possible that it's not true. But if absent evidence, I would start with the assumption, teach how it works. And if you want to propose that it would be better to do something else, I would say that you should have evidence for that claim. Other stuff, memory is better when information is presented in a format that highlights relationships between items. This isn't reading instruction. This is a long ago psychological research that's not controversial at all. Of course, memory is better when we highlight the relationships between items. So that T in act and action is helping understand the phonology, the grapheme phoneme correspondences of the T in a way that would not be available if you taught phonics without morphology. The spelling of the W in the word to, if it's just random, it's hard. But if you can tie it to the connection with twice 20 between, you can understand why there's a W there. And then you get the insight, hey, letters don't even need to be there to write sounds. So once you have that idea, there's something called an etymological marker that's not a letter that's not even a grapheme. Well, that's easier to run into people and deal with the O. And there's things like plural canceling markers, and also once you hit one concept, you can link to other concepts. So, and this, I would argue, makes sense because we already know without any debate that memory is better when informed, when information is presented with relationships. Another point that is we make in the 2017 paper, I think that's where it's from, visual memory dramatically better when meaning can be attached to the to be remembered pattern. So these matrices, these word sums, are taking advantage of that. So let's look at theory in the literacy research. Something that I think is quite important theory that's what I think is not important, but there's a major theory from Perfetti about the lexical quality hypothesis that I find compelling. And he talks about features of lexical quality, orthographic, grammar or morphosyntax, semantics, and he also talks about constituent binding on them, and the phonological. There you go. And so we have we have different features of lexical quality, phonological, orthographic, semantics, that the better representations we have for these things, the quicker access we have to lexical items when we're reading or writing. But he also talks about a constituent binding feature, which is the extent to which these features are bound. And so that is something that John Kirby and I drew on, talking about this. So when we make this model, many will recognize the triangle model with orthography, phonology, semantics. We're proposing that morphology is the one feature of the language system that actually links to all of those elements. And perhaps one of the reasons morphological knowledge, whether gained through instruction or not, but perhaps better instruction is going to make it better. One of its ways of its doing this is binding these elements, so that through the lexical quality hypothesis, that's one argument that we're putting forward as something to be tested more. Another theory of learning that I find super powerful, cognitive load theory. I'll make a link to a document I have on linking structured word inquiry and cognitive load theory. But again, this idea of building good schema in our mind that we can pull up quickly, and multiple memory routes and various things about how we can store information we can teach so that we get information taught more clearly, or then we can retrieve it more effectively. So I would argue that that's something to think about in terms of structured word inquiry as well. A classic paper by Carol Chomsky where she talks about the lexical spelling hypothesis. I highly recommend this paper, even though it's 1970. And this idea that she talks about, the lexical spelling, she does note that morphemes don't even have pronunciations until they're in a word. Well, the practice that I'm recommending of not pronouncing bases in isolation, or any morpheme in isolation, but naming their lexical spelling, really, naming their spelling. The base of pleasing is P-L-E-A-S-E, even though the E doesn't surface. And one reason for that is because you don't know if it's going to be pronounced please or ples or pledge, but the consistent thing is the spelling, the underlying abstract spelling. So if you look at the article that I wrote with Gina Cook and others, I'm referencing how this ties to Carol Chomsky's paper. And I was brought to Carol Chomsky's paper to read it because of reading Carlisle's 2020 review. I'll let you read that to yourself for a second. So Carol Chomsky was proposing hypotheses for instruction very much like what I'm working with and others are working with structured word inquiry, and we haven't tested them yet. It's time to do that testing, I would argue. So summing up, SWI, structured word inquiry, built on a very simple hypothesis: instruction should accurately represent the content being studied. The current research is very early, but everything we've seen is promising. The direct research is small but promising, and there's lots of theory and related research with morphology in particular supporting it. We have to keep in mind that long-held, untested hypotheses to avoid morphological instruction for less able and younger students directly contradicted by the evidence we currently have. And I'm happy to be contradicted on that, but I would need to be given research showing harm being done by including morphology and or etymology from the beginning. Students who continue to struggle despite what is thought to be best practice tell us that we should explore instructions that we shouldn't only look for small refinements of what wasn't working. Why not take a step back and look and see, is there some bigger thing that we might be able to do? One of the things that it didn't surprise me that the morphological inventions were particularly helpful for less able kids, because the kids who are struggling in school already are signaling, the way you're teaching me isn't working. Give me something else. And if my main difficulty, one of my difficulties, is a phonemic awareness, a phonological processing problem. Well, let's maybe not put all the leverage for my learning on the thing that I have a deficit in. What if I instead build on some strengths? What if if I triangulate and let me work with meaning and work with these matrices and my visual and work with the motor memories of these structures, by how I write out the word sums. Well, now I have things that I can use to inform things, and at the same time, I'm actually giving more accurate instruction about how grapheme-phoneme correspondence works because I'm teaching them in their context. So there's good logical reason for this that we should keep in mind. And, we have a community of educators around the world are offering a proof of concept that this is not only that this is possible from the start. Now, when I point to the videos and I point to the fact that people are doing this all over the world, I'm not claiming that's research evidence, but what I'm encouraging people to do, and I would love more researchers to do this, is there's labs around the world you can go look at. There's let me just stop the share here. So I'll come back. So there's places, schools around the world where you can, in videos and stuff, where you can watch and see how kids are engaging with this. It's not evidence, but if we want to have researchers, we do have evidence that morphology seems to be a wise thing to teach from the beginning and with less able kids, but we don't know how best to do it. So why not have researchers go into schools and see how it's being done and get ideas that they can take back to their labs and devise interventions and do them. That is actually happening right now in some places. But I invite everybody out there to look at these and get a sense, build your own understanding. If I can use some, if I just showed you a matrix and you understood the spelling of does for the first time, well, maybe that's something we should offer kids. If you've understood the T in action for the first time, this is something that is evidence that you have a good reason to look at this further with others. So I guess with that, I'm going to bring this to a close. And if you have questions, certainly you can email me, and there's lots of stuff to explore. And it's a real delight to be invited to this again. And I'm looking forward to seeing all the other presentations.
Thank you, Pete. I'm really excited to have you again because last year it was great. So always happy to have you again with a new topic. Sorry about my door opening. And for those of you who are interested in more about this topic, I encourage you to go and watch some other presentations. On the same topic, there's one by Scott Mills, there's one by Sue Hegland, and there is another one that I am completely missing off the top of my head right now. But I think those are the main three. If I did not mention.
And I did mention that one of the things that's exciting about this, all the resources that are going, the people doing this. So Scott's got a brilliant new resource that I'm excited about
That's true.
That I've got right here.
Oh,
and
cool.
And Sue Hagland's website is brilliant. And these are people who I've been working. Scott from a classroom's context. Sue Hagland's been from an OG perspective for a long, long time. So this is the point. There's a community of people that are and you guys are doing this work. So there's so many different people doing it, bringing their own different backgrounds, combined around the concept. Let's see if we can use scientific inquiry to deepen our understanding of orthography over time. And the cool thing is, when you use science, your understanding grows every year. So
yes,
you don't have to be fast. I think you will agree that you understand more than you did last year. And
oh yeah, well yeah. I mean, I was so crazy. I went back to get my master's in linguistics. So yeah. Yeah, it never ends for me. But you can also, all the people that Pete and I have mentioned are also in the exhibit hall too with their, they should have links to their websites if you're interested in the resources. So please leave your questions. Dr. Bowers can answer your questions during the 2 weeks. Please make sure your questions are as succinct as possible and try to make them as generalized as possible so that he can answer the most questions as possible during the 2 weeks.
And I can't promise that I will be succinct in my responses.
No, he's not. Yeah, I wouldn't make that promise for you. I don't think it's not in your DNA. But it's good because we get lots of information.
All
Okay,
right.
so thank you very much and enjoy the workshop. And I'm
All
going to
right.
stop